Welcome to this video on the history of creation from the tabletop role-playing game Exalted. Exalted is a game of heroes, shiny heroes, empowered by their particular patron deity with the power of manipulating the fundamental principles of reality, which translates to exalts engaging in a variety of legendary and seemingly improbable feats, like single-handedly defeating entire armies, building floating cities, jumping over mountains, writing letters that persuade ruthless gangs of bandits to give up a life of crime and to donate all of their loot to the poor, or end a drought by infiltrating heaven and seducing a weather goddess. Unfortunately, the Exalted all suffer from varying types and degrees of insanity thanks to killing the titans who originally created the world. But without further ado, the history of creation. In the universe of Exalted, essence is the source and building block of all things. Essence is not anything as crude as matter or energy, though it composes both. Essence contains every possibility, every form, every thought and imagination can conceive. To describe the universe as it existed before shape, before boundaries, before space, or even time, is a task beyond the capability of even the wisest and most learned exalt. To describe a thing also limits it, by excluding what it is not. This state of pure essence is often considered to be identical to the chaotic and alien realm of the wild, and yet, the wild itself is marred by the concept of time and separateness. Not even the creatures of the wild, the Raksha, can describe or even comprehend the universe before the existence of the Shinma, Advaita Iraivan. They can only speculate about this period of oneness they call time not. Advaita Iraivan might be considered the first Shinma. The Shinma defy human comprehension, except as abstract concepts, joined to an overwhelming will to impose its unique concept as far as possible. The Shinma are, simultaneously, vast, unknowable beings of nearly limitless power, and yet single-minded to the point of being incapable of understanding anything unrelated to the concepts that birthed them. Advaita Iraivan was the Shinma of separation, a simple enough concept with tremendous implications. The first thing it separated from time not was itself, and by doing so, it could observe the million times million possibilities within the universe. By the simple act of observation, Advaita Iraivan bent the universe towards separation, causing other concepts, equal in power to itself, to emerge, such as Nadakara, the Shinma of shape, Nirguna, the Shinma of qualities, Nirvishisha, the Shinma of identity, Nirvilkalpa, the Shinma of communication, Nishkiriya, the Shinma of conflict, Nirupatika, the Shinma of space, and Dharma, the Shinma of desire. One of the effects of Advaita Iraivan's separation was the universe into is and is not, reality and not reality. What became of those parts of the universe defined as not real? Were they consigned to nothingness? Did they become a separate realm of imagination or nightmare? Regardless, Advaita Iraivan continued to observe the Shinma and discerned patterns of a new concept, awareness. These conscious patterns differed from the Shinma. These patterns, the Raksha, were not only self-aware, but could conceive of patterns apart from themselves, limited only by their own will. They possessed no true form, but remained substantial. They could change themselves, and each other. This portion of the universe, the wild, was a swirling maelstrom of chaos, as essence and will clashed in an endless interplay between the Raksha. Now most of the Raksha were content with this shapeless existence. Some Raksha conceived of a new concept, or rather, were seduced by it. It was called the Games of Divinity. The very idea of the games was so powerful that it compelled several Raksha to conceive of another concept, permanence. These Raksha reshaped and rebuilt themselves as changeless beings, the Primordials. The Primordials, after making themselves permanent and no longer subject to the fluidity of the wild, built the Games of Divinity, the first and the apex of their grand design. Out of the wild, The Primordials, led by their king, Theon, the Imperial Chaos, twisted and shaped a portion of the wild and locked it into a single form. First, they built a parlor to house the Games of Divinity, Yu-Shan, Heaven. Then the Primordials set to work building a great complex engine that would sustain and power the games. This masterwork of the Primordials, their island shelter in the storm of chaos, was called Creation. Yet creation was a vast, complex undertaking, requiring constant attention and maintenance, and the Games of Divinity could not be left unattended for long by the players. So the Primordials created servants, the gods, whose sole duty was to protect and maintain what their masters had created. With their work done, the Primordials retired to Yu-Shan to while away the eons with the unknowable Games of Divinity, occasionally making forays into creation to amuse themselves while awaiting their next turn. The gods, in turn, created their own servants, the first truly intelligent mortal creatures, the Dragon Kings. The Dragon Kings assumed such duties as the gods required, and supplied the gods with worship to feed their strength. The gods were divided into two broad categories, the Celestial Bureaucracy and the Terrestrial Bureaucracy. The mightiest of the gods made their home at the center of creation, Mount Meru. But in time, the gods grew resentful of their eternal servitude. They had come to covet the Games of Divinity, despite being denied access to them. Yet the gods could not take up arms against the Primordials, as their creators had bound them specifically against what it was they considered. In fact, all of the creatures of the world had been forced to submit to the oath, except for one, the lowliest and weakest of the Primordials' creations, humanity. But in humanity, the gods saw the instrument of their liberation. But 1,000, 1,000,000, or even 1,000,000,000 humans would be as insignificant to the Primordials as a large boot stepping on ants. The gods were interrupted in their conspiring by the primordial Autothon. At first, they feared that they had been undone, but Autothon had as little love for his brothers and sisters as the gods. The Primordials routinely mocked Autothon for his sickness, for his ugliness, and broke the things he created to amuse themselves. Autothon eventually abandoned Yu-Shan for creation, where he found humans to be fascinating and felt great affection for them, insofar as a primordial can be said to experience such a feeling. Autothon kidnapped 600 creatures of a humanoid species called the Lintha, who possessed the natural ability to gather and manipulate essence. Autothon vivisected the bodies and souls of the Lintha, and used his findings to draft the blueprint for a new weapon, the Spark of Exaltation, keyed to his own primordial essence. Autothon delivered the plans for the exaltation to the conspiring gods and adapted it to the nature of those gods who would create them. The mightiest gods, the celestial incarna, crafted sparks of exaltation from their own substances. The chief of the gods, the unconquered sun, created the Solar Exalted, who, like their patron, would excel in all things. Luna created the Lunar Exalted, whose forms could adapt as they needed and survive almost any hardship. The 5 maidens of the planets created the Sidereal Exalted, who received custody of the Loom of Fate, where they could track and manipulate the destiny and fate of every being in creation. Another primordial, Gaia, joined the conspiracy for the sake of her lover, Luna, but like Autothon, created no Exalted. Instead, she bid her 5 most potent souls, the elemental dragons, to create exalts of their own. These Terrestrial Exalted, the dragon-blooded, were the army under the command of the Celestial Exalted. Though individually weaker than a Celestial, the Terrestrial Exalted would have 2 important advantages. First, they were more numerous than the chosen of the Incarna. The second advantage was that the dragon-blooded could pass their powers down through their bloodlines to their many offspring, where the Celestial Exalted were strictly limited to 700. The gods secretly identified those mortals who had attained greatness, or possessed the potential for greatness, and granted them the exaltations, then began training them for war. When all was ready, Autothon opened up the arsenals of his favored creations, the mountain folk, to outfit the Exalted, and begin the Primordial War. Accurate records of the Primordial War are scant, thanks to the use of time distortion weaponry during the conflict and subsequent catastrophes. The recollection of the Primordials have likewise suffered. The Primordials were caught off guard in the beginning, but quickly recovered under the leadership of their king, who was the principle of absolute authority. Then, the impossible happened. The Exalted slew one of the Primordials. Now, the Primordials could countenance death. After all, they had built death into creation to recycle the souls of mortals through reincarnation. But they were too massive, too complex, for the mechanism of death to successfully process. The Primordial to die wailed as it was dragged down, its corpse blasting a hole through reality. The result was the creation of a new concept, Oblivion, and a new realm to contain it, the Underworld. The Primordials were shaken, and for the first time, they felt fear of what the gods had wrought. Theon, who had led the Primordials out of the wild, whose command had given shape to the Games of Divinity, heaven, and creation, briefly doubted his right as an absolute ruler. That doubt was all that was needed. Several more Primordials were slain and fell into the underworld, their bodies folding in on themselves to form massive tombs near the mouth of Oblivion to contain their broken component souls. The other Primordials, terrified of this deathless state, surrendered to the treacherous gods and their exalted creations. The gods wanted to execute the Primordials, but Gaia intervened on behalf of her defeated brethren. Her plea was supported by a night-cast assassin of unimpeachable character named Gural. The gods relented and instead sentenced the Primordials to eternal imprisonment. Exalted sorcerers and diplomats extracted oaths from the Primordials on their own names to never again enter creation unless summoned. Then the Exalted destroyed several of their component souls, reducing the Primordials in scope and power. Lastly, the Exalted turned the king of the defeated Primordials inside out, and sealed up the diminished creators within his mutilated flesh. This was the creation of the Hell Realm of Malpheus. But the Primordial of Hierarchy, she who lives in her name, as a final act of defiance to the gods and the Exalted, sacrificed a portion of her own being to destroy all that she held dear in creation. The fires of the Primordial's wrath, the three spheres' cataclysm, scoured 9/10 of creation not only of life, but of entire principles and concepts, mostly dealing with stability, order, and perfection. So thorough was this destruction that no one could even recall the things that she destroyed, only that there is an absence, and that creation was somehow lessened. More troubling, the slain Primordials, the Neverborn, hurled curses at their murderers in their last moments. These potent curses attached themselves to the Exalted, subtly warping their personalities towards cruelty, madness, and hubris the longer they lived. But with the Neverborn slain and the Yozis imprisoned, the gods now possessed the prize they had desired, the Games of Divinity. Yet they could not leave creation unattended. The unconquered sun bestowed the creation-ruling mandate upon the Exalted, and the crown of thunders on the Dawncast Exalt Solar, Mirala, the gladiator queen of Rathus, his consort, and the Exalt who held the distinction of having beaten a Primordial to death with her bare hands. Mirala took the mantle Queen of Creation and made Rathus the seat of her new kingdom, or rather, queendom, the Aqua Fountain. Many of the Solar Exalted who followed Mirala in the Primordial War remained in her service in peace, but some chose to go their own way and drifted off to the far corners of creation, to continue fighting the remaining creatures of the Primordials, or establish kingdoms of their own. The Solars had defeated the Primordials, but they did not rule creation, not yet. Mirala sent her forces out from the Aqua Fountain to bring the lands and people under Exalted rule. After 62 years of campaigning, diplomacy, colonization, and engineering, the rule of the Aqua Fountain stretched from the Summer Mountains to the Yellow River and southwest to the farthest edges of creation. Mirala's rule, however, was undermined by one of her own supposed supporters, Gural, the same Gural who had argued in favor of showing the Primordials mercy after the war. Secretly, he had been corrupted into the personal service of Theon, now Malpheus. He manipulated his own allies into researching the magic and binding rituals that transformed Malpheus into the Yozis' prison. But this information had been falsified by the Solars, who never expected one of their own to turn against them, yet feared some Yozi spy might penetrate their records. At Malpheus's command, Gurral submitted his soul to enslavement via a ritual known as the Investiture of Infernal Glory, becoming the first Akuma. Gurral's scheme was stopped by the Solar Queen Kalin and her lunar mate Taman, who sacrificed his life to slay Gurral. The tainted site of the battle, Kalin's loss, was quarantined, and all records related to Gurral sealed by the direct order of Queen Mirala. Lytek, the god of exaltation, observed subsequent reincarnations of Gurral for signs of corruption. Despite fascination with demonology, they would show no evidence of being Akuma, but Gurral was only the first of several exalted, celestial and terrestrial, who would willingly join the Yozis and mortgage their souls for even greater power. After a century, Mirala decided that she would move her capital from Rathus to Mount Meru on the Blessed Isle. As the gods had once ruled creation from its greatest mountain, so would she. Secretly, she had become irritated with the petty intrigues of her court, and wanted to focus the attentions of her solar heroes outward, to conquest and empire building. As work began on the new capital, several exalts discovered that their artifacts had ceased to function. The mountain folk, who had crafted the artifacts in the first place, now remotely deactivated them by disconnecting them from their complex creation-spanning power grids. When the Solars demanded an explanation, the mountain folk simply told them that the war was over and the weapons were no longer necessary, that they required the essence for their own projects. When the Twilight Caste Solars inquired after Autothon about the behavior of his children, he gave no answer. When the Solars demanded that the mountain folk restore their weapons to working order, the mountain folk politely refused and returned to their work. The Exalted then demanded that Mirala take action against the mountain folk, but were dismissed out of hand. The Queen of Creation held no fear of the Jadeborn, numerous and powerful though they were. She wanted the Exalted focused on the outside world, not chasing the mountain folk through their subterranean cities and deep roads. It was this dispute that led to the end of the Aqua Fountain. Some Exalted had enjoyed a century of relative freedom after the Primordial War. Others regarded the mountain folk as a threat and wanted to deal with them as harshly as they had dealt with the Primordials. Mirala, as queen and commander, found the taste of disobedience sour, and tried to tighten her control over the Exalted once more. Instead, the other Solars bucked her rule and demanded that she grant them greater say in the governance of the realm. They presented her with a proposal for a deliberative body of Solars, in which each of the Unconquered Sun's heroes would have an equal voice. Mirala dismissed the Solars' proposal. She held the Crown of Thunders and the creation-ruling mandate. Without her rule, she claimed, the Solars would fall to infighting and intrigue, as some already had. Yet, other Solars, farther from Mirala's rule, had spent the century honing their own powers until they were on par with her own. The civil war on Meru lasted only a year, but by the end, the new capital lay in ruins, and the golden hero vassals of Mirala and the rebels reached a stalemate. The rebels then presented Mirala with a new deliberative proposal. This time, she would retain her title as Queen of Creation and have a limited veto power over the mandates of the deliberative. The deliberative would remain in Meru, under her watchful eye, and each Solar was required to spend 2 of every 5 years in the White City, as the capital was to be named. Lastly, open warfare between Solars was prohibited in the city. Mirala, reluctantly, agreed to these terms. 109 years after the end of the Primordial War, the subject of the first meeting of the Solar Deliberative was, unsurprisingly, the Jadeborn. The Solars of the city of Denensor, who were pupils of Autothon, stood in defense of their mentor's children. They could not suppress the call for action against the mountain folk, but they did moderate it. In the end, the Solar Deliberative presented the Great Maker with a choice. Either he could impose some restraint on them that would neutralize them as a threat, or the Solars would take their own action, with all of the potentially lethal consequences such action might entail. Autothon, rather than see his beloved mountain folk come to harm, imposed the Great Giaz on them and trapped them underground forevermore. A year later, The Deliberative declared the Aqua Fountain Kingdom to be at an end, and renamed the domains of the Solar Exalted as the Realm. The First Deliberative Age was a time of expansion, as mortals began settling the Blessed Isle. The Exalted redirected their talents towards civil administration, exploration, and artistic endeavors. There were still wars, mostly between the kingdoms of the independent Solars and the remnants of the races still loyal to the Primordials. But the Deliberative had, by demanding that Autothon impose the Great Gias on the Jadeborn, created an irreparable rift between the Exalted and their one-time benefactor. For 11 years, Autothon's greatest mortal heroes had secretly searched creation for the components necessary for the Primordial to craft a device called the Ewer of Souls, a smaller copy of creation's Well of Souls that sustained and reincarnated the souls of the living. In year 121, Autothon and his 8 heroes quietly filled the Ewer with 100 million human souls and snuck out of creation. It took a full season of investigation before the Solars realized what had happened. Autothon's Twilight Caste disciples loudly blamed the Solar Deliberative for forcing the Great Maker into a self-imposed exile. 500 years of relative peace followed the departure of Autothon to elsewhere, but the peace was broken by the Raksha, who had watched creation with rapt interest ever since the Exalted overthrew their primordial cousins. The Raksha hated creation as an abomination, a defilement of the perfection that was the wild. Yet they also regarded the human soul as something of a delicacy, with each soul providing new sensations and sights unique from any other. The Raksha reasoned that if the souls of humble mortals were such a delight, how much more so must be the souls of the Exalted. So the Raksha conspired to lure the Exalted to them, out to the borders of creation, and shape themselves into forms that humans found so pleasing that the hapless mortals began calling them the Fair Folk. Beginning in year 639, the Fair Folk plucked a few colonies here and there, left a few victims alive but drained of their souls, breadcrumbs for the Exalted to dutifully follow. In year 650, the Raksha prince, Ginnungagap, invaded creation where he was met by the Exalted. The Fair Folk army of dissolution did not get the banquet they had hoped for, and instead were thrown back into the wild. It was during the Dissolution War that many Exalted realized that the wild offered the potential to expand both their domains and their power. The Fair Folk invasion opened up the era of unfurling horizon as the Solars turned their attention to the borders of creation, leaving their kingdoms in the hands of terrestrial daimyo and bureaucrats. The Solars and Lunars pushed the boundaries of creation further outward, locked the chaotic wild into stable, recognizable forms, and then used sorcery to shape the lands to their liking. This expansion continued unimpeded until year 1107, when one of the 2 missing primordials appeared, near the heart of creation. This unnamed primordial survivor had spent over a millennium reshaping itself for guerrilla warfare. It knew that it stood no chance in open battle against the Exalted, but it could bleed the realm slowly, and that is precisely what it did. Its best chance came when the Celestial Exalted were tied up in wars against the Raksha. Cataclysmic disasters struck the cities of creation, while the Primordial slipped away before the Sidereals and Lunars could track its movements. Ultimately, the Solars were forced to reach a hastily drawn-up peace agreement and diplomatic immunity with the Fair Folk, so that they could return home and deal with what would later be known as the Aftershock War. This single primordial harried and ambushed the Exalted for 108 years, until it was finally slain in year 1215, a mere 600 miles from the slopes of Mount Meru. The primordial was sent to join its never-born kin in their tormented, deathless slumber, but it did not go alone. Many veterans of the Primordial War died to bring the Aftershock War to a close. Following the Aftershock War was the era of shining reflection. The Exalted once again turned their attention from martial pursuits to development of civilization and culture. A sorcerer by the name of Halius turned from the mystical theories laid down by Brigid, the first sorcerer, and began to combine both sorcerer's principles and engineering techniques to create a school of magitech independent from the practices of the mountain folk. Other creations of the era included the development of the 5 directional tongues by solar linguists of the creation-defining Parlant Society. These 5 languages were Earth Tongue, Sky Tongue, Flame Tongue, Sea Tongue, and Forest Tongue. All these languages except Earth Tongue had been crafted with the inherent creation-defining grammar and tonalities, so that by simply speaking them, humans were stabilizing creation against the influences of the wild. A sixth language, Riverspeak, developed independently of Exalted influence, as a patois of the other five, much to the curiosity and delight of the solar linguist who started the program. After another 500 years of relative peace, two events occurred in year 1721 that shattered the unity of the Solar Exalted. The first was the death of Facet Raven, a Nightcast veteran of the Primordial War. The Exalted were no strangers to death, either as its cause or its victims. It was the manner of Facet Raven's death that caused an uproar. He died in his sleep, peacefully, from old age after nearly 3 millennia of life. Until that point, the Celestial Exalted believed that they were functionally immortal, that the spark of exaltation could sustain them for all eternity, and yet Facet Raven was buried with 3,000 years worth of honors and tributes, and the Solar Exalted were gripped by a sudden, maddening sense of urgency as they realized that their time was finite. In year 1734, a militarist philosopher of the Twilight caste named Rose Petal T launched a military campaign against his fellow Twilight, Borzan, killing him and seizing his territory. This pair of events marked the end of the era of shining reflection and began the era of 1,000 struggles, as solars turned upon each other when the deliberative failed to sanction Rose Petal T for the death of Borzan. By year 1827, the first solar deliberative ceased to exist in the wake of a plot by the solars of the White Jade Feather Society to assassinate their rivals within the White City. Exiles retreated from the city and fortified themselves within their manses to launch their wars or wait for the war to come to their lands. This war between Exalted waxed and waned for another 500 years until someone, or something, effectively broke creation. Records of the time of cascading years is a jumble of subjective, misremembered, and contradictory events. The only reliable information about the period was that it lasted for 217 years, 129 days, 11 hours, 43 minutes, and 8 seconds, according to a colony of dragon-blooded, with a perfect chronometer crafted by the Twilight caste that matched the position of the unconquered sun in the sky when contact was re-established. But for those within creation, some experienced the time of cascading years as a millennium, others as a single afternoon. 73 celestial exalts died during this period, and some assumed that they were somehow responsible for the event. In year 2543, the five maidens declared that the problem that affected creation had been solved by the Exalted, and would say nothing else. The period of long silence followed the time of cascading years. The Exalted had stopped their fighting, but were wary of both war and further technological development, as they feared triggering another time of cascading years. In year 2678, a second solar deliberative was established by a circle of Primordial War veterans led by a Zenith caste solar known as the Most Supreme Hierophant. Ostensibly, the Hierophant was the first among equals. In reality, the Hierophant's powerful and perpetual charms bent the deliberative towards or against whatever matter the Hierophant chose to take an interest in. One matter that the second solar deliberative was called to deal with was the question of the so-called free demons. Per the terms of the end of the Primordial War and their imprisonment in Malpheus, the Yozis and their component souls, otherwise referred to as demons, were obligated to abide by summoning from an exalt of commensurate power. Yet some exalts, usually sorcerers, occasionally dealt with demons without the benefit of a binding ritual. A few exalts actually just wandered into Malpheus, plucked up a particular demon they had a rapport with, and carried them back to creation. While many demons were reflections of their Yozi master's broken and crippled state, a few were little different than they had been before the Primordial War, and the Solars found them to be pleasant companions, helpful assistants, or invigorating rivals. Of course, having demons running loose in creation runs contrary to the purpose of imprisoning them in the first place. In year 2730, a compromise was reached in the form of the Treaty of Limbs. So long as a demon was registered with the Ministry of Malphian Liaisons, under the protection of a particular solar patron, and obeyed the law, they could enjoy limited freedom in creation. Once the Solars were comfortable renewing their Magitech research, a team set to work on one of the most ambitious projects the Solars had ever undertaken: the design and construction of a creation-spanning, self-aware automaton, constructed along very similar lines to one of the Yozi, but lacking the spiritual components. This automaton would allow communication and coordination of creation's billions of mortals. In year 3193, on the 5th day of Ascending Fire, the Exalted Sorcerer Engineers activated the system called I Am. The subsequent networking of I Am throughout creation by year 3204 marked the beginning of the Era of Dreams, the zenith, no pun intended, of the First Age. In year 3366, a circle of solar exalts known as the Black Nadir Concordat emerged from the underworld bearing a new art, wrested from the tombs of the sleeping Neverborn: necromancy. As necromancy was revealed by the Black Nadir Concordat, controversy immediately followed. The Concordat was accused of corruption, and that their necromancy was a trap laid by the vengeful Neverborn, and that the dead monstrosities summoned by necromancers burned at the holy touch of the Zenith Cast, a clear sign that the art was anathema to them. Yet the Concordat argued that there was no difference between a necromancer summoning a shade or a shambling corpse and a sorcerer summoning a demon from Malpheus, that necromancy was no more dangerous than sorcery, and like sorcery, was only dangerous in the hands of the unwise or unprepared. In year 3490, Solars of the militant faction of the Deliberative proposed a massive military exercise, one that would simulate a large-scale incursion of fairfolk into creation. The proposal, later named Operation Wild Hand, passed in year 3491 with the support of the Cauldronist faction, whose ultimate goal was to reshape creation to their will by controlled opening and sealing of wild zones. The Sidereals protested this action, but in year 3493, Operation Wild Hand began in the Greenland of Cedar Fall Province. Somewhere in the planning and execution of the operation, the Solar Exalted forgot to evacuate the mortal population of the Greenland, or even warn them that they intended to turn their entire territory into a massive wild zone. Occasional administrative oversights are bound to happen. 16 months later, Operation Wild Hand concluded with the victory of the Exalted over the armies of the Fairfolk and Behemoths called into creation. The Solars got to work off some of the kinks that came with centuries of peace, test the latest Magitech weapons, reshape the Greenland, and take advantage of new resources and study new phenomenon once the wild zones were resealed. The deaths of 20 to 40 million mortals were a tragic necessity to keep creation's greatest defenders in fighting shape. Operation Wild Hand was the largest example of the Solar Exalted who, in the grip of the great curse laid upon them by the Neverborn, inflicted suffering on their subjects and allies, or ignored it. After all, they had made creation peaceful, prosperous, and free from all but the most extreme peril or want. Those who did not sit in the Solar Deliberative saw things a bit differently, especially the Sidereals. From their perspective, the Solars were descending rapidly into decadence and madness. Their experiments and reckless use of creation played havoc with the loom of fate. When the Sidereals complained, the Sorcerer Engineers of the Twilight Caste responded by expending massive amounts of essence, just to see how far they could push the loom without breaking it. Finally, the Nightcast Solar, Gold-Shadowed Arrow, a veteran of the Primordial War, took it upon himself to assassinate 4 Solars, 6 Lunars, 2 Sidereals, and 300 Dragon-Blooded, based on his suspicion, only suspicion, that they were Akuma. The Sidereal Exalted finally reached their breaking point. The Fivefold Fellowship convened in the great chamber of the Loom of Fate, where the Solars could not observe them, and cast hundreds of astrological charms upon the loom, gleaning thousands and thousands of potential futures until the 3 most likely visions of the future appeared before them. The first great prophecy was a world without gold or silver, and so called the Vision of Bronze. The Solars and Lunars would be cast down from their rulership over creation. Some would be cast into the sea, and the rest hunted forevermore. The Sidereals would bear the burden of creation survival on their shoulders, while still fulfilling their heavenly duties in the Bureau of Destiny. The second prophecy was a confusing array of visions of war and strife, with a single nexus. The sidereals revealed their concerns about the Solar's deepening madness to the lawgivers in person. In some versions, the Solars agreed to take greater steps to police themselves. In others, civil war broke out as paranoid Solars hunted the Lunars and Sidereals into exile, and creation became a wasteland that was ultimately devoured by the wild. These disparate visions were bundled together as the Vision of Gold. In them was the potential for even greater glory than the Exalted had already achieved, and also the potential for destruction of all of creation. The final prophecy showed the Sidereals holding their silence and doing nothing, as the Solar spiraled deeper into insanity until they made creation into a hell worse than anything the defeated Primordials could dream of. This third, the Vision of Darkness, was rejected out of hand as the Sidereals divided into factions. The Bronze faction, led by Chejop Kejak, a chosen of the Maiden of Secrets, and the Gold faction, led by Tamiz Ushan. In the end, the Bronze faction carried the majority, because it was the most certain. The first deaths of the usurpation were not Solars or Lunars, but Sidereals. During the Night of Fallen Stars, the Bronze faction slew their fellow Sidereals who tried to escape heaven and warned the Solars of what the Bronze faction intended. But the Sidereals' plot against the Solars required other participants. The Sidereals were not mighty enough to meet the Solars in open battle, or even slay them in secret. Many of the Dragon-blooded were receptive to the Vision of Bronze. They were not as affected by the Great Curse, and saw what the Solars were becoming. More practically, the Solars had unknowingly alienated many Dragon-blooded in their 35 centuries of rule. The usurpation of the Solar Exalted was years in the planning. Gods and elementals of the bureaucracies of heaven and earth were distracted. The conspirators were moved closer to the Solars while others, particularly the Lunar Exalted, were dispatched on missions to the borders of creation. During an event later known as the Final Calibration Feast, the die was cast. Dragon-blooded warriors and sidereal assassins fell on the Solar Deliberative as they celebrated and murdered many of them. But merely slaying the Solars would not be enough. Celestial exaltations were designed to return to the custody of the god of exaltations, Litek, between incarnations. So, as the Dragon-blooded and Sidereals turned their blades on the Solars, a small team of Sidereals invaded the Ministry of Exaltation and took Litek captive. The Sidereals extracted the Solar Exaltations from Litek's cabinet using a strange, Jade device. By the time the Celestial Lions and Guardian Gods realized something was amiss and rushed to Litek's office, the Sidereals were already gone. Less than a third of the Solars survived the first blow of the usurpation, mainly because they were not present for it. The Dragon-blooded, aided by the Sidereals in their command of greater astrology, hunted the Solars relentlessly, as the Solars had once harried the Primordials to their destruction. But the usurpers paid dearly for their victory. Thousands of Dragon-blooded and dozens of Sidereals, who numbered only 100 to begin with, died taking the creation-ruling mandate from the Solars' hands. Things had not gone according to plan. 50 Solar Exaltations remained at large in creation, thanks to charms and sorceries of concealment that not even the Sidereals could penetrate. The Sidereals, once they had collected as many exaltations as they were likely to, took the artifact known as the Jade Prison and sank it to the bottom of the inland sea. Yet the Sidereals had another problem. They had not only defied the creation-ruling mandate, but laid violent hands upon a god of the Bureau of Heaven in doing so. The Bureau was unified in its condemnation of the Sidereals, and called for the harshest censures and punishments possible. The Sidereals, to cover up their crime, overloaded the astrological house of the Mask, which governed secrecy and concealment, with complex horoscopes, so many in fact that the Sidereals irreparably damaged the astrological sign and very nearly destroyed the Loom of Fate. With the breaking of the Mask, it is common knowledge in heaven that the Sidereals were the guiding force of the usurpation, but no one, not even the Sidereals themselves, can specifically describe what anyone did during the usurpation, as they remain creatures of fate. This left the Dragon-blooded as the sole rulers of creation in the absence of the Celestial Exalted. The Dragon-Blooded reorganized themselves on strict clan lineage under a military government, the Shogunate. The rule of the Dragon-Blooded tried to maintain the great bureaucracy of the old realm operated under the Solars, but they lacked the spiritual and magical insights to bend essence as powerfully or subtly as the Celestial Exalted. Therefore, many of the technology and weapons of the Solars fell into disrepair. Eventually, the Shogunate itself fell to civil war, as Dragon-Blooded fought for dwindling panoplies and armories of First Age resources. Meanwhile, the Bronze faction moved among humanity, cloaked in resplendent destinies as monks and preachers, denouncing the defeated Solars and the exiled Lunars as anathema, and praised the Dragon-Blooded as demigods, whose rule was divinely mandated by heaven and the 5 elemental dragons. Elsewhere, the defeated enemies of the Exalted watched the usurpation with great interest. The Neverborn from their lightless tombs in the underworld, and the Yozis from the Hell Prison forged of their own bodies. They had hoped, futilely, that the Exalted would at last destroy one another and leave creation for them. This was not to be. The Shogunate, weakened and inferior in every way to the old realm, did not fall. The Sidereal's Jade Prison was a curiosity, as it appeared to be a crude duplicate of the underworld, not simply an artifact, but a small realm of existence, outside of fate, which was why none of the dwindling numbers still loyal to the Solars could find it. The usurpers had tried to placate the lower souls of their victims with grand tombs and grave goods, but the higher souls followed the fate of all mortals and entered the underworld. Some Solars looked on their deeds without the veil of the great curse over their eyes, and repented for what they had done and failed to do, and so passed peacefully into reincarnation. But others raged and wept bitterly. They were the masters of creation. They had won it with Diclave in battle. To be betrayed, overthrown, and cast down could not be their end. The Neverborn, who had drank from the same well of hate and self-pity, saw in the broken ghosts of the Solar Exalted the dagger they would drive into creation's heart. 5 of the Neverborn approached the ghosts of the Solars with offers of revenge, and more importantly, power. They made no secret of their intention to plunge all of creation into the underworld, and then into the abyss. But the Solars could, conceivably, rule the underworld for a very long time until then. Most of the Solars rejected the Neverborn outright, but 10 of the Solar Ghosts accepted the Neverborn's offer of tainted power. The Neverborn grafted the tattered remnants of their own component souls to these ghosts, producing the God Kings of the underworld, the Death Lords. 3 hidden Solars would later join the Death Lords' ranks in the aftermath of the usurpation, bringing their total number to 13. The Neverborn soon found their new champions to be a bitter disappointment. The Death Lords spent more time jockeying with each other for power in the underworld and testing the limits of their new abilities than bringing about creation's destruction. After all, if creation was doomed to fall into the abyss, there was no great rush. Except for one Death Lord, the Dowager of the Irreverent Vulgate in Unrent Veils. She spent long years staring into a breach in the underworld, known as the Well of Udir. It is unknown exactly where the well led to. It may have been a gateway directly into the tomb of her never-born master, into the abyss itself, or a realm unknown to even the primordials. Wherever the well's source, the Dowager coaxed the strongest pestilence ever imagined from its depths, the Great Contagion. The Contagion slew millions with each passing year, spreading by touch, through the air, and even the water. The Dragon-Blooded, otherwise immune to any natural sickness, died right alongside those they governed, as the Great Contagion defied their most potent charms and sorceries. The gods of Yu-Shan sealed themselves up in heaven and cut off contact with their terrestrial counterparts, for fear that the Great Contagion could affect even them. 2 other Death Lords broke away from their warring and politicking to hatch a scheme of their own, unwilling to let the Great Contagion run its course and allow the Dowager to claim the glory of destroying creation for herself. These Death Lords were the First and Forsaken Lion, and the Eye and 7 Despairs. The Lion and the Eye made contact with the fair folk in the wild, and invited them to invade creation and unmake it. A mighty Raksha Lord, Prince Balor, eagerly accepted and launched the Balorian Crusade, breaking through creation at all four directions. As life in creation sickened and died, the wild-shaped hordes raced towards the center of creation, unmaking or mutating vast swaths of lands and peoples. A group of dragon-blooded soldiers launched a desperate mission into the abandoned solar manse built in the city of Vanchao that the Shogunate had labeled the Palace of the Anathema. 2 of the dragon-blooded died against the traps and defenses of the ancient manse. A third was sacrificed to awaken the powerful weapons contained therein, and a 4th sacrificed to the guardian of that place. The lone survivor, a captain of the 9th Legion, activated the weapon known as the Sword of Creation. This ancient artifact, crafted by the Solar Exalted with the guidance of Autothon, scoured creation of the fair folk and of the Great Contagion. But 9 out of every 10 people, mortal in dragon blood, were dead, and creation had lost much of its territory. The dragon-blooded captain was soon faced with a new threat, this time from her own kind. With the shogun dead and creation in ruins, 7 generals of the shogunate met at the Lap to parcel out the land surrounding the inland sea and the Blessed Isle between them. These 7 tigers heaped yet more destruction on the already battered cities of the Threshold, seizing what men or material they could from daimyos and peasants to make their invasion on the Blessed Isle. The captain knew that the fair folk still lurked in the border marches. Despite having lost Prince Balor, the fair folk would gladly try to finish their destruction of creation if they perceived weakness. The captain sent messengers to the 7 tigers to cease their foraging and rearmament for the good of the shogunate. The 7 tigers returned her messengers' heads with her missives stuffed in their mouths. The captain was left with only one other choice. She turned the Sword of Creation against the 7 tigers as they mustered to invade the Blessed Isle. Lightning broke apart Jade war striders and siege engines. Water elementals smashed the ships and dragged them down into the sea. Screaming winds froze men's blood solid inside of their veins. By the time the captain deactivated the Sword of Creation once again, the armies of the 7 tigers were broken, and the officers had their generals in chains, ready to present to the captain as a token of their submission. When the envoys reached the dragon-blooded captain, she accepted their surrender and took possession of the 7 tigers, who were never seen again. Following the captain's victory over the fair folk and the 7 tigers, an emissary from the bronze faction of the Sidereals came to the palace with an offer of alliance between them. The captain promised to accept, so long as the emissary's master, Chejop Kejak, presented himself to negotiate. Kejak was infuriated by the impertinence of this lowly terrestrial to summon him, but he had few other options. The Bronze faction's already precarious position with the Bureau of Heaven following the usurpation had been further undermined by their failure to foresee and prevent the Great Contagion, as well as the Balorian Crusade. Kejak had overthrown the Solars in the name of stability. If humbling himself before a terrestrial meant peace for creation, then so be it. Kejak traveled alone and on foot to the Palace of the Anathema and then knelt before the gates, with his head bowed like a supplicant, for a full day and night. The captain was impressed by this show and opened the doors to him. This was to be the first of several meetings between the Chosen of Secrets and the woman who would later be known as the Scarlet Empress. Kejak then laid out his proposal to her, that the realm would be resurrected, with the Scarlet Empress as its head in law and fact. The dragon-blooded would be gathered, trained, and harnessed under her rule. But the Empress was suspicious of this plan. She knew that the power of the kind Kejak offered would inflame strife and civil war, both of which would bring disunity and diminish the strength of the dragon-blooded. Kejak conceded that this would be true of a strictly secular empire, but that was not what he was offering. Her realm would be both temporal and spiritual. Kejak's support would come in the form of the Immaculate Order. The Immaculate Order had existed since the usurpation, quietly supporting the shogunate by promoting the philosophy that the dragon-blooded were essentially divine, and that mortals were obligated to obey them. If the realm and the Immaculate Order were united, mortals could be conditioned to regard the dragon-blooded as gods in their own right. The dragon-blooded, in turn, would be trained in martial and spiritual discipline, obedience to the realm, obedience to heaven, and obedience to the Empress. After 9 days of negotiation, the Scarlet Empress and Kejak reached a wary accord. The Empress then used the Realm Defense Grid, as she would later insist the Sword of Creation be called, to project her image to every corner of creation, dressed in the scarlet robes and regalia that were her namesake, to proclaim that she had vanquished the Fair Folk and the Great Contagion, and that her realm now stood in place of the fallen Shogunate. Peace was her gift to the people. Obedience would be their gift to her. Within a fortnight, most of the dragon-blooded on the Blessed Isle swore fealty to the Scarlet Empress. Within a year, the Blessed Isle was completely conquered. True to his word, the monks of the Immaculate Order proclaimed the divine authority of the Scarlet Empress in every village, town, and city. Between the Empress's world-spanning apparition and the proselytizing of the Immaculate Order, many mortals were happy to offer their thanks, prayer, and most importantly, taxes to the realm. However, the Scarlet Empress was faced with another problem. She lacked the forces or equipment to conquer the Threshold Principalities. Without those rich provinces surrounding the Blessed Isle, the realm could be isolated and ultimately ignored. With advice from Chejop Kejak, the Scarlet Empress created an organization, the All-Seeing Eye, responsible for diplomacy, domestic and foreign intelligence, and subversion. Most of the Threshold provinces willingly joined the fold. Those whose rulers proved stubborn suffered sudden, but always fatal misfortunes. While many terms between the realm and his tributaries was negotiable, one could never be. All anathema were to be subject to the Wild Hunt, an office of the Immaculate Order staffed by the most potent dragon-blooded martial artists, trained to slay Solar and Lunar Exalted wherever they appeared. But the territories of the River Province escaped the Scarlet Empress's control, and they would not be swayed by threats of invasion or embargo. Most notable was the city-state of Yu-Shan, founded on the ruins of the ancient First Age city of Directional, by the 7th Legion of the Shogunate. The 7th Legion had taken no part in the Seven Tigers Uprising, and retained the largest arsenal of First Age weaponry in creation. The Legion rejected the Scarlet Empress's claims of rulership, and declared that she was neither sovereign nor shogun, but a low-ranking officer whose actions in defeating the Fair Folk were commendable. However, she had not demonstrated the political acumen or battlefield command of a shogun, and therefore the 7th Legion did not recognize her. The Scarlet Empress sent her legions to invade the river provinces on 3 occasions, and each time the 7th Legion threw them back. The Scarlet Empress could not afford to use the Realm Defense Grid against Yu-Shan and risked destroying the First Age weapons she coveted. So she signed a truce with Yu-Shan and hoped that an opportunity might later present itself, then turned her attention to more pressing matters. Meanwhile, in the underworld, the Neverborn summoned their Death Lords to the Labyrinth for a council. The Yozi had recently communicated with them, particularly the Yozi who had been least changed, the Ebon Dragon. During the First Age and in subsequent periods, several Solar Exalted had come into the service of the Yozis and pledged themselves as Akuma to the Demon Princes. This gave the Yozis an opportunity to perform limited research on the Exaltation, and they believed that they could not only trap them, but corrupt them without diminishing their overall power. Better still, the Yozis had discovered the location of the Jade Prison at the bottom of the Inland Sea. Unfortunately, the Yozis were cut off from creation unless summoned, and were unable to send any of their own agents powerful enough or competent enough to retrieve the sparks of exaltation. But the Death Lords could slip into creation, steal the exaltations, and return without gods or exalts being any the wiser. In exchange for teaching the Neverborn how to corrupt solar exaltations into their service, all the Yozis would require were 50 sparks of exaltation for their own use. Their cousins would be welcome to the rest. The Neverborn commanded the Death Lords in unison to bring them the exaltations at once, and warned them that failure would result in an eternity of suffering. The Death Lords, working in concert for the first time, used necromancy to alter and reanimate a dead behemoth according to the designs given to them by the Yozis, then sent it along the bottom of the ocean to collect their prizes. But the Death Lord's careful construction and planning was foiled when the beast did not crack open the prison as intended, but shattered it, releasing all of the solar exaltations at once, instead of a few at a time. The beast desperately tried to snatch as many as it could with its jade chains, but 100 flew free, leaving the Neverborn and the Yozis 150 to divide between them. The Neverborn were displeased. Yet again, the ineptitude of the Death Lords had frustrated their designs, but the Yozis considered the operation a wild success. They had gotten what they wanted. The Neverborns had gotten less than what they wanted, and 100 new solar exalts were on the loose and bound to wreak havoc in creation. Besides, the Yozis had seduced Solars to their cause before. Inevitably, some of these newborn lawgivers would join them. Once the Yozis had the 50 exaltations in hand, they taught the Neverborn how to construct a device that would warp solar exaltation towards the abyss, the monstrance of celestial portion. The abominations that stepped out of these cages were the Death Lord's most potent servants, and the Neverborn's newest champions, the Abyssal Exalted. After 763 years of rule, the Scarlet Empress disappeared. The Empress had, in the past, gone on sabbaticals within the Imperial Manse to placate the guardian spirits of the realm defense grid. But after a year with no word, the great houses of the realm, most of whom were the Empress's descendants, the Immaculate Order and the Bronze faction, grew increasingly nervous. She had been gone for too long. The Sidereals could not locate her in the loom of fate, which only increased their concern. The Scarlet Empress ruled according to a philosophy she called the Thousand Mazy Path. All power in the realm not only flowed from her, but was dependent strictly on her good graces. She had never named a successor, nor made any plans to do so. The realm was not designed to function without the Scarlet Empress, and those dynasts who could have taken the throne hesitated in doing so, out of fear of the return of the Scarlet Empress and what she might do to whoever she found sitting on her throne. 1 year after the Scarlet Empress's disappearance, everything seemed to fall apart around the same time. The legions of House Tepet faced off against a solar warlord in possession of one of the exaltations the Sidereals failed to imprison, one who had defeated the Wild Hunt half a century before and united the barbarian Ice Walker tribes of the north under his command, Jurgen Kaneko. Kaneko had designs on Linowin, a client state of the realm, and the Tepet legions were sent to reinforce the garrison. But at the Battle of Feudal Blood, Kaneko's Ice Walkers overwhelmed and annihilated the forces of House Tepet, removing Tepet as a contender for the throne, and earned Jurgen Kaneko the title, the Bull of the North. That same year, another client state of the realm in the Scavenger Lands fell, but not to any mortal host. The Death Lord, known as the Mask of Winters, the youngest and most audacious of the 13, was the first to openly reveal his existence to creation, and conquered the city-state of Thorns in a single night. The Mask opened up a massive shadowland outside of the city, large enough for his behemoth corpse fortress, Juggernaut, to drag itself up from the underworld and into the land of the living. The Dragon-Blooded dispatched the Mask's horde of shambling corpses, but they were little match for his newest warriors, who bore the same caste marks as the Solar Exalted, but where the Solar's marks shone like the golden sun, these abyssal marks bled a substance as dark as the maw of oblivion. With Thorn's dragon-blooded defenders slain or enslaved, the Mask turned the city into one of the largest shadowlands in creation, and the dark, but still beating heart of an empire of the dead in the world of the living. It is into this time of tumult that the Solar Exalted return in force. The realm teeters on the brink of collapse. The provinces descend into chaos as legions are withdrawn to the Blessed Isle to reinforce the great houses in their battle for the throne. Barbarian tribes test the boundaries of the realm's tributaries and clients. The Lunar Exalted emerge from exile to observe the new incarnations of the Solars that they were mated to and failed to protect. The Sidereals are a fellowship divided against itself, as the aging Bronze faction clings to the Great Prophecy, while the Gold faction moves with renewed but cautious hope that the vision of gold can be brought about, and the Chosen of Death ride forth from the underworld with power equal to the Chosen of the Sun to drag all of creation down into oblivion. Meanwhile, deep in Malpheus, the Ebon Dragon plans his wedding. He knows that love will at last set him free. And that was the history of creation. I've been an Exalted fan since it came out in 2001. It's one of the few settings that does the kitchen sink well, because everything operates on the same fundamental power resource. While the Dragon-Blooded are distinctly East Asian in flavor, you can have Pirates of the Caribbean, Gundam, Conan the Barbarian, Dynasty Warriors, A Fistful of Dollars, History of the Rune Staff, Batman, Fist of the North Star, The War of the Roses, and Tomb Raider all in the same game and have it fit together and make sense, which makes for some interesting contrasts between characters and ultimately interesting stories. But I think I will return to the World of Darkness in the next video. I've done various monsters for the last 6 or so months. Maybe it's time for a little lore about those who fight monsters. We'll see. Until next time.